So welcome everybody to a new session of the Logica Universalis webinar. Today we will have a session dedicated to Lewis Carroll. And the chairman of the session is Leo Corry, member of the Editorial Board of Logica Universalis. Please, Leo, from the University of Tel Aviv. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Just a minute. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, my name is Leo Corry. I am professor of history and philosophy of science at Tel Aviv University, and my main field of interest is the history of mathematics and logic. And I am very glad that I was invited to moderate this session of today. We will have a brief introduction by Steve Folan, who is the chairman of the Lewis Carroll Society, and then we will have the talk by Amirouche Moktefi. Stephen is a technology consultant. He was the editor of Bandersnatch, which is the newsletter of the Lewis Carroll Society, and he has given presentations on the evolution of the Alice stories into modern media. And he has also spoken about the influence of Lewis Carroll on management thinking, and both of these topics seem to be very interesting. But they will not be our topics today. He has also worked with the Horse Hospital in London and the Chilean Embassy in London to create art exhibitions on the theme of Alice. So, as I said, he will give a brief introduction before we go into the main topic and talk of today. So please, Stephen, the floor is yours. Stephen?
Okay, my name is Steve Folan, and I'm the chairman of the Lewis Carroll Society. A bit of the background to the society: we've been going for more than 50 years, and obviously we look to promote the work of Charles Dodgson and Lewis Carroll. And this is many and varied. For example, at the moment at the Victorian Albert Museum, there's a really famous and very good exhibition going on about Lewis Carroll that includes parts about the game of logic. After that, in November, there's a celebration of 150 years of Through the Looking Glass, and there's a conference organized by Dr. Francesca Colt up at the University of York. So there's a lot of activity around Charles Dodgson, and there are lots of different aspects to his work, and these include mathematics and logic. So if he was alive today, we would probably describe him as a polymath. You know, his interests were broad, varied, and deep. I mean, mathematics, logic. He was one of the first photographers when photography was like the internet of its day. Writing in lots of many forms. He wrote obviously the children's stories, but he also wrote poetry, he wrote puzzles, he wrote games, and he was an inventor as well of sorts. And he was one of the first writers to look at cross-marketing his books and products. So there's a lot about him apart from the stories that people know about. I think that all of this together, in a way, looking at all the different facets of Lewis Carroll, means that he's one of these sort of artistic people and creators who's trying to look behind the surface of things to find the truth behind it. And something like mathematics and logic, the great lenses to detect it and to represent it. And he mixed this search for truth, if you like, with a playfulness, because he wanted to entertain and challenge the reader. Amirouche's talk reflects this as well, and his title is excellent because it's the sort of paradox and wordplay that would really appeal to Lewis Carroll. What is funnier is that sometimes these paradoxes have a grain of truth in them. I haven't heard Amirouche's talk before, but looking at the title of it, you even have songs in the 1970s, The Who songs. If everyone knows the song from The Who, Substitute, I have a line in there saying, the simple things you see are all complicated. And the next line doesn't apply to Amirouche because he doesn't look in the least backdated. So he's, you know, so he's still very cool in terms of that. And the other thing that I thought of when I saw the title, because it really did make me smile, is one of, I like music a lot, and one of the artists, Sinead O'Connor, would exactly use this sort of title as an album title. So it's a really interesting one because it's obviously, it challenges, it amuses, and there's a grain of truth in it as well, which I'm sure Amirouche will explain throughout his talk. And I just want to thank you for letting me have the opportunity to introduce the talk, introduce Amirouche on behalf of the Lewis Carroll Society. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for this introduction. And I think we have a couple of minutes. If anyone has any question about the society, even before we start, you could direct it right now to Stephen, and it will be a good opportunity to hear about that. Anyone who wants, please raise your hand and I will give you the floor. You can do it also at the end of the talk, perhaps mixed or in combination with what Amirouche will have to tell us today.
Well, I would like just to ask to Stephen, what exactly are the activities of the Lewis Carroll Society, concretely speaking, if they are organizing some events or I mean, meeting with people and things like that.
Yeah, well, certainly this year we've been very active because it's the 150th year of Through the Looking Glass. So I've been working with the Victorian Albert Museum, Macmillan's, the publisher. We've had online talks from people like the Flann O'Brien Society, also Alberto Manguel, you know, looking at different aspects of it. And when I'll try and find a link to the conference, which is online up in York, and there are lots of different aspects of it where people do. We've had talks from the One Society, and they were looking at the sort of the algebraic formula and the way that the stories, and comparing it with, trying to think, the Bronte sisters and their stories as well. And we do look beyond just the obvious, you know, we look at the science aspects as well. And actually today in London, Jane Skelly, who's the secretary of the society, is chairing part of the Royal Chemistry Society historical, where they're talking about mirroring, you know, used in the Carroll stories, but also used in chemistry as well to describe some of the effects with molecules. So a lot of the things that we think, you know, are puzzles and quite, you know, and I'll use the wrong word, sort of superficial and jokey within the stories, turn out sometime after 150 years to have deep philosophical meanings, you know, in other areas of expertise as well. So the society itself pulls in lots of people who aren't necessarily literary people, but also chemists, physicists, fashion people. Like, you know, I've given talks on the media aspect of it as well. You know, when Carroll wrote it, you know, I mean, I looked at it as a way of describing organizations and behaviors as well. There are lots of things, and there are so many ideas condensed into the two stories that, you know, it's quite incredible. And there are, you know, there are puzzles, there are games in there, and there are also sensory things in there as well. At the very end of the first story, I think, when Alice comes out of her dream, you know, she's her sister is describing the sounds she can hear and relating them back to the dream as well, which is, you know, which is quite unusual. You know, it's a very sensory way of telling the story. So every time I go back to it, and maybe I read it once a year when I've got to do a different talk or I'm attending something, I normally find something, you know, quite different in there.
Yeah, thank you.
And I know that next year Amirouche is organizing a workshop, a whole day, you know, around the Lewis Carroll piece as well. And we'll have people, and I'm imagining, I'm not going to steal all of Amirouche's thunder, but we've got people, you know, in the UK, such as Mark Richards, who's an ex-chairman of the society, who are absolutely involved in the mathematics and science around Lewis Carroll. And I'm imagining that they will be looking to be involved as well. So we're always looking to, we're quite a broad church, and we're always looking to bring people in because they always see different aspects to the story and the ideas that are brought up, and some of the people who've been long-term members just don't see.
Yeah, well, I may add that the Society has a very nice website and informative at that. And I think that this is the address that Jean Holland has, Jean-Yves has added here. And if not, it's very simple to find it in Google. And I advise you to do that because this is a very interesting and well done site. So I think we're ready to begin with the main talk of today. And just a minute. So I want to introduce our main speaker, Amirouche Moktefi, who works at the Tallinn University of Technology, Schools of Business and Governance. And he's a senior lecturer there, having completed before that a PhD in History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Strasbourg. The title of his dissertation was Didact and Seduce the Symbolic Logic of Lewis Carroll. And I may say that before that, he had a master's degree with a thesis with an analysis of Lewis Carroll text, What the Tortoise Said to Achilles, and which is a very famous text published in mine in 1895. So that we can see that where the focus of his interest is. But if you look at his very long and interesting list of publications, you will easily see that this interest is not limited to Lewis Carroll alone and his work. And I was particularly impressed to see the relationship that one can see in the titles. And now I'm interested also in reading in detail the relationship between Lewis Carroll and Peirce. And particularly, or at least in some of the text, concerning the idea of abduction in Peirce's logic. So just to give you a few examples taken from the, as I said, very long and interesting list. For example, this year, 2021, we have What Are Rules For? A Carroll-Peirce comparison. And I may say more, many of the details are, or many of the texts have to do with questions related with diagrams, which is also a very nice topic to think about in relation with these people. So we have, for example, appearing in a book, Diagrammatic Representation and Inference, the article that I mentioned, What Are Rules For? Carroll-Peirce comparison, and then revisiting Peirce rules of transformation for Euler-Venn diagrams, and the phenomenology of diagrams. I may say that as a person who is working with the question of diagrams in the Euclidean tradition, I will surely take a look at some of these articles, and hopefully we may also hear about that today. So I am glad that we have this talk today here, and we have Amirouche to speak about it. And the title of his talk is Why Make Things Simple When You Can Make Them Complicated? An appreciation of Lewis Carroll's symbolic logic. So Amirouche, please go on. The stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you also, Steve. I'm very, very happy to be here today and to talk about this work. Just a couple of remarks about what has been said so far. And of course, you're right, Leo, that my work started with Lewis Carroll. I'm trying to go a bit into several other topics in the recent and not so recent years. But that's the thing with Carroll. He's working on so many things, and that by definition you get interested in so many topics: the relation between science, literature, diagrammatic reasoning, history of logic, history of geometry, stuff like this. So once you start working on Carroll, inevitably you end up, interested in so many topics. Thank you for highlighting some of those topics I'm interested in. Diagrams, indeed, this paradox of the inference, as we call it, etc. Of course, I will not be talking about all of these. I think I will not even mention basically the paradox, although it's Carroll's most famous work. But if anyone is interested, of course, in these kind of questions that I don't mention in my talk, please don't hesitate to contact me or to just ask questions at the end or something. I will be happy to react on those as well. Small other remark also is that the link that Jean-Yves did put in the chat is so far it's for the workshop that I'm organizing in next April on Lewis Carroll's logic. So you're all welcome to have a look, and if you're interested, to submit a paper or express interest at least, and then we can agree on a firm deadline. And the other thing is about Lewis Carroll Society. I wanted to add something else, which is that Lewis Carroll Society, I mean the British Lewis Carroll Society, and there is an American North American Lewis Carroll Society, played a very important role in the development of Carroll studies. I mean, these societies are from the 60s, I think, but they really played a very important role in making Lewis Carroll a respectable academic topic, let's say, because they had journals, of course, where people can publish, can gather. They had regular meetings where academics also are welcome. And of course, it's very difficult for these kind of societies because the membership and the audience they address is very heterogeneous. You have scholars, of course, but you have also fans, people interested only in the fantasy, in the Alice tales, etc. And you also have different topics: photography, politics, science, etc. So I think these societies really played a very important role. They edited original materials such as the Journal of Lewis Carroll. They re-edit regularly the original works of Lewis Carroll, for instance, the pamphlets. So I think this is really, I mean, they really play a very important role, and they played a very important role in my own work. So I'm really happy also that Steve is here and is representing the Lewis Carroll Society. And of course, everyone interested in Lewis Carroll basically should, I highly encourage you to have a look at the website and maybe even join if you're interested. Okay, that's what I wanted to start with before going to my presentation for today. So like I said, the thing with Lewis Carroll is that there are so many things with Lewis Carroll. There are so many interesting topics. Even just the logical part, I mean, there are so many questions and so many problems of the logic of his time that are so interesting, and philosophical questions as well. You mentioned the rules, Leo, before, etc. What I try to do today is more give, as I call it, an appreciation, meaning what does all this mean? I mean, because there are a lot of accounts nowadays about Lewis Carroll's logic. I published myself a couple of them. Many other colleagues wrote some accounts, some wrote book length accounts actually of Lewis Carroll's logic in different languages. So what I'll try today is not necessarily to expose so much the details of Lewis Carroll's logic, but more to try to make sense of it. I mean, why is he doing what he's doing? And specifically, we all know that Lewis Carroll made some decision concerning the existential import of propositions that really that was against everything, everyone else in the symbolic tradition, and that made his work very, very complicated, while all the others really simplified it. And this, of course, had a big impact on how his work was perceived by other logicians. And I will try to explain why he did that. Okay, so let me go ahead with a short introduction, because I don't know how many historical seminars we had so far in this webinar, but I would like to start with a few words about the history of logic, because this is a historical work. Let me just take with my clock, sorry. Okay, so this is a history of logic seminar. I will be talking about history of logic, so I wanted to say just a couple of things about the way I proceed. So as we all know, modern logic was born in 1879. This is what a lot of books tell us. This is what, of course, most logicians actually, I guess, hold. It's something that was, of course, popularized by Van Heijenoort's account of the history of logic, the famous anthology from Frege to Gödel. Now, of course, I'm not going necessarily to go a lot into this, but I just wanted to say that, of course, these kind of decisions, these kind of choices have consequences and have some implicit assumptions. Because we all know basically that modern logic is born in 1879, but we don't necessarily always know why modern logic is born in 1879. You often hear some kind of circular argument that Modern logic was born in 1879 with Frege's work. And when you are asked what is modern logic, well, modern logic is the kind of thing that Frege was doing, etc. So basically, it's kind of turning around, and of course, you can look at Frege's work, and it's of course a great work. Frege introduced two-dimensional language to represent some propositional logic with implication as the main operator, and it serves for the purpose of giving mathematics stronger foundations, rigorous foundations, something like that. Okay, this is what Frege did. And this, yes, it's nice and important research program, as philosophers of science say. But of course, he wasn't the first to offer this program, and he wasn't even the first or the only one to do this. Not even in 1879. I'm not even talking about the other years. So why this year specifically, and why this author specifically? But where I would like to go here with this discussion is something a bit different. It's the fact that again, if by modern we mean what we are doing today, so what we are doing today comes from there. We could do that, of course, but then you're not really doing history. What you're doing is what Ivor Grattanguinness calls heritage. It's the idea that you are looking for the advancement of the discipline. How advanced is it? So you would say, for instance, that given what we are doing today, Frege was the most advanced in 1879, meaning the closest to what we are doing. That's the top. And then you can search for the next step. Or, you don't have historical moments, you have historical steps, etc. Now you can do that, but again, if you want to know how logic was in 1879, if you want to know how logic was, this is really important what I'm saying here to understand the way I proceed. If you're not interested in the advancement of logic, but you're interested in the state of logic, how was logic in 1879? Well, you don't treat Frege alone, right? Because that's the whole point. If Frege was an exception, but what were all the other people doing? Now, 1879 is really a beautiful year for logic. Because you have a lot of great works, not just in mathematical logic, but even within mathematical logic, you have a lot of beautiful works. If you focus on Frege alone, you can miss some other works. I will give you a couple of examples. For instance, these 3 books were published in 1879. They are quite nice, actually, very interesting ones. So the first one, Principles of the Algebra of Logic. So I think it's the first book with such a title, referring explicitly to Algebra of Logic by Alexander McFarlane. So it's a book where the author offers, I think it's the first one also after Boole, a book with a mathematical theory of logic based on equation. And there are some really nice technical innovations as well, such as the representation of the universe of discourse, stuff like this. The second book is, of course, quite well known. Less than it should be, but it's still well known. It's the new edition of this Jevons Principles of Science. Of course, it contains a lot of very interesting ideas, including the plans of his logic machine. And this is, of course, very important because around 1880 there are several logic machines. 2 at least were built, and some other were planned. And you can have this. Jevons started a bit this trend. And this is really a beautiful work. And the third one is Alexander Bain. It's not necessarily a mathematical logic book, but it's a book that had a really, very big importance on the diffusion of mathematical logic, because it's through this book, it has some kind of chapter where it describes the state of mathematical logic. And a lot of other countries discovered this work, the work of Boole, and started doing mathematical logic. I mean, this is the case of Hugh Macaulay in France, or the case of Joseph Delboeuf in Belgium, for instance. The first mathematical logic works in Poland were based on the early work, were discovered, that is discovered through the work of Alexander Bain. So British ideas, British mathematical logic became known in Poland through the account of Alexander Bain, and this led to the first Polish mathematical logic research. So these books are very interesting, and you would miss them if you look beyond Frege. But even if you are interested in this heritage things, you don't care about the state. You want the advancement, and you want to find what's really the state. What logicians are really in 1879 built in some 2-dimensional notation for propositional logic with implication as the main operator in order to offer mathematics the foundation it deserves, which is what Frege did. But even in that specific year, he wasn't the only one. I would mention one. It's not the only one. I could give other examples from 1879, but the one I'm interested in is this one. this book called Euclid and His Modern Rivals from an author no one knows today called Charles L. Dodson. So it's a book where the author wants to compare the existing method, the existing rivals of Euclid. So what he does is that he introduces a two-dimensional notation where he introduces a sign for implication, okay? A sign for implication. His idea is simply to represent demonstrations, mathematical demonstrations, Euclidean demonstrations by different authors, including Legendre, Peirce, the father of Charles Peirce, etc., and other mathematicians. And he translates them with this, he writes them with this logical notation to make sure that there are no gaps, and then he tries to analyze them. And his aim was to show that Euclid was better. But anyway, the project is basically the same. And as you can see, it's always very difficult to say really the differences between this and this, or where does it start, where does it end, etc. Now, why I'm mentioning this book specifically, because it's also a book published in 1879. It's very interesting because it fits basically in this research program that you can find with the idea of, given mathematics, a logical language, and all these kind of things. But it's more interesting for us specifically for two reasons, two little anecdotes that I will say right now. Well, the first one is that maybe you never heard of this book before, but you probably have seen it somewhere, because this book actually, it was used for the very first logo of the Wikipedia. The first logo of Wikipedia is made with a page from this book. Why? Because this book is written as a play, a theater play. The idea of the author was that it's not just a serious book. He also wanted the people to read this book. So he says, I'm writing in order to be read. And therefore, this book became kind of, for Wikipedia people, a symbol of writing for the millions, for a wide audience, okay, not just for specialists. And the other thing that's really interesting for us is that the author of this book, Charles R. Dodson, is actually the same guy as Lewis Carroll. Okay, Charles Dodson is the real name of Lewis Carroll. So Lewis Carroll was writing with his real name, Charles Dodson's mathematical books, and he was writing, as we know, some fiction, some novels, some child tales with his pen name, Lewis Carroll. So, and I will be talking about Lewis Carroll today. I'm not going to talk about this book on Euclid and his modern rivals specifically, because that was where he started his interest in mathematical logic. But I will be talking about the system of logic that he developed 2 years later. But before that, I would like to proceed with just a few remarks also about Lewis Carroll. And I know many of my friends from the Lewis Carroll Society are also here. And people are interested in Lewis Carroll specifically. And you will see how it's connected to this logic scholarship. So again, I said this is Lewis Carroll, but if you want to know who Lewis Carroll is, I guess most of you will just, look for a biography of Lewis Carroll, and you will find plenty of them. Lewis Carroll is one of those probably the most biographed logician. You can find more than, I can cite a dozen of them, and there are certainly many more. Of course, there are a lot of biographies of him because of his fame as a fiction author, not because of his fame as a logician, but still. Now, if you read all these biographies of Carroll, there is a really serious problem there, at least for a long time, which is that the main question that all the biographers are asking is, how did the man who wrote these math books like this one write also this one? So the point is that if you look at the life of Dodson, the guy who was writing these math books, it's actually a rather boring life. He lived almost all his life in Oxford. He's writing math books. He goes sometimes to London for theaters. In summer, he goes, like all British people, to the south, those who can, to Eastbourne or places like this, to the seaside. And that's it, basically. He went only once out of Britain for a religious trip, but I don't think we know of him much, actually, other than that. I mean, his life is not very interesting for a biographer. But most importantly, there is a big contrast between how boring biographers find his mathematical works and how, of course, fantastic and amusing people find his literary works. So this became what some authors call the Lewis Carroll mystery, or the Dodson-Carroll paradox, etc. How can someone who's writing so boring books of mathematics write such fantastic literary works? And the consequence of this is that people try to find some kind of continuity between the two. So either they over-interpreted the Alice books, and they try to show that there is a lot of math there, etc., in order to find this continuity between math and literature. So they over-mathematize the Alice works. Or some other people, they over-fantasized or over-Alicized the mathematical work, and try to show that it's necessarily fun and reduced, or didn't take them so seriously. And there is really a big consequence of this is that when it comes to Lewis Carroll, it's difficult to talk about it very seriously because people expect to have something funny, something interesting. And you can see, for instance, someone like Martin Gardner, who played a very important role in the rebirth of Carroll studies. He writes something like this. Oh, sorry, let me just move this. Okay, Charles Dodson, who wrote Immortal Fantasy under the pseudonym of Lewis Carroll, was an undistinguished mathematician who delivered dull lectures at Oxford and penned equally dull treatises on such topics as geometry and algebraic determinants. Only when he approached mathematics in a less serious mood did his subject, in his way of writing about it, take on lasting interest. So you see, there isn't a big motivation to study seriously Lewis Carroll. You need to look always for the less interesting, less serious parts of his work, literary works, etc. Well, luckily, not everyone followed this advice, but for a very long time, this idea kind of dominated. In the last, let's say, 30 years, though, you have some authors who started studying Lewis Carroll seriously, and it's thanks to this trend. And this is, I'm trying to say here, why you see so many works in recent years on Lewis Carroll's logic, but it really took a long time for that in mathematics as well. So this idea of sorry, I don't know why my next slide is not moving. Okay, so I wanted to mention at least 3 authors who really worked in this direction. So you have William Warren Bartley, for instance, who edited some unpublished fragments of Lewis Carroll's Symbolic Logic, and as a second part. You have Francine Abeles, of course, who published extensively on Lewis Carroll, and this is one of her books. And this one is a collection of Lewis Carroll's logic pamphlets. And of course, George Engelbretsen, who for about 30 years has been writing on the subject. And this year he published, he collected his Carroll notes in one volume that you can see here. So thanks to these authors, today you can say that we have Carrollian scholarship, or there is growing interest in Lewis Carroll's logic. And you have, of course, many other people who help here as well. For instance, this one is from Francine Abeles, so they just appeared. It's an overview of Lewis Carroll's logic in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So basically, you have a lot of resources nowadays that expose Lewis Carroll's logic. And this is why I don't want to do one more. My point is not just to expose or to present Lewis Carroll's logic. Today, we do have actually quite good accounts of Lewis Carroll's logic. You have also some resources that I would like to recommend. So here, this is a website by Mark Richards that Steve mentioned before. So you have different, of course, features here, but I would like to invite you to consider this the features under the game of logic here. So you can find there, for instance, this demonstrator of Lewis Carroll diagrams. You can find also a demonstrator of his symbolic logic. You can find the bibliography on Lewis Carroll's logic, etc. So if you're interested in Lewis Carroll's logic, there you have a lot of resources for that. And like I said, in next year in spring, I think it will be really a first. We are organizing a workshop on Lewis Carroll's logic, and therefore, I already know that many scholars working on Lewis Carroll's logic will be there. And so if you are really interested, please don't hesitate to contact me about it, or just submit an abstract. You can find the call for paper on the website. So as you can see, we can say today, probably 30 years you couldn't say that, okay? Maybe even 20 years. Today you cannot say anymore that Lewis Carroll is understudied or something like that. It's not true. Actually, compared to Lewis Carroll is probably one of the most studied logicians, at least from those logicians of his time. We don't have studies much about John Neville Keynes or Hugh McCall or even John Venn or people like that who are much more influential than Lewis Carroll, actually, and to some extent more important and more interesting. But Lewis Carroll is certainly well studied relatively. But so what I'm trying to do here in this paper that appeared in Logica Universalis and that I'm trying to present a bit today is really not just an exposition of his logic, but really making sense about this complication. Why does Lewis Carroll make or provide a complicated system when he could have made a very simple one, actually, at least a simpler one, just like all his colleagues? Okay, in order to do that, I would like to go ahead and really give you a bit the general context in which Lewis Carroll is working. So this context is of course the context of mathematical logic after the work of Boole. So Boole is a British logician who developed this mathematical theory of logic in the mid-19th century, and from there you have certain number of works. You cannot say you had tradition, but you had interest in the subject, and several authors developed similar systems. So, but what all these people are doing is what we call the problem of elimination. Now, the problem of elimination was presented by Boole himself as the general problem of formal logic. Some of his followers, like Jevons, he called it the problem of logical science in its complete generality. And it was also recognized by some of the opponents, to some extent, to symbolic logic, as the central problem of symbolic logic. This is, for instance, what John Neville Keynes says. So what is this central problem of logic, as seen in this tradition, okay? So basically, let's say that you have some information, you have some concrete premises, okay? In natural language, you have some concrete premises, and you want to find what conclusion follows from those premises. Of course, a syllogism is a very simple case. In a syllogism, you have two premises, and you want to find the conclusion that follows. Now, you are in natural language, but instead of treating this problem in natural language, what you do is that you translate it into a formal language, you formalize. So what you get is that those premises that you had before, those propositions, you formalize them and you get formal premises. Now that you have your formal premises in the calculus, that's it, you formalize them. No, sorry, in the formal language, then you proceed with the calculus to get the formal conclusions. What formal conclusion follows from those formal premises? And this calculus can be done by a machine, at least in accordance with rules, etc. It can be blind. And once you get your conclusion, you just interpret the conclusion, you translate it into the natural language, and you get your concrete conclusion. So you see, the idea is instead of doing all this work within the natural language, you go do it in the formal language, meaning you appeal to symbolism or whatever to do this. So basically, as you can see, the formal language is very important because, of course, some languages might be better than others or might lend themselves better to calculus than others, etc. And in order to do this calculus, so you have different logicians who are inventing different languages for this. For instance, you have here a symbolic notation, the first one, which is from Boole's work. Boole offered the symbolic system with the symbolic notation, algebraic notation, then introduced diagrams, for instance. It's the same thing. It's, of course, it's the formal language as well. Some people built machines. Actually, why not? You could very well introduce the data with this keyboard that you have there. It's exactly like a computer. You introduce the premises, and then you can see on the screen, you can see the conclusion. So you have different methods by different logicians. And slowly you had a kind of competition between logicians at the time as to what would be the best method. What will be the best notation, what will be the best system. You have a friendly competition there. And you can see that growing very slowly because when Jevons published his book, for instance, his system, he says, there are now two systems of notation, Boole and Jevons, giving the same results, and therefore, of course, he's saying that his own system is self-evident, while the other one is dark. That's the Boole one. So he invites people to choose the best one. And then after that, other systems are there. For instance, Peirce in 1880 writes, 4 different algebraic methods of solving problems in logic of non-relative terms have already been proposed by Boole, Jevons, Schroeder, and McCall. I propose here a 5th, which perhaps is simpler and certainly more natural than any of the others. Not only these logicians are introducing additional systems, but of course they are promoting them as the best. So for them, basically, modern logic starts with them. And this is, of course, very natural. That's the whole point. And look at the next one. It's by a student of Peirce. So she's not developing Peirce's own system. She's introducing her own system. So this is Lad Franklin. And she writes, there are in existence 5, because there were 4 plus Peirce. So yes, it's Boole, Jevons, Schroeder, McCall, and Peirce. I propose to add 1 more to the number. So you see, the whole idea here is that you have different logicians introducing different systems. Now, how do they compare their methods? It's very simple. When you want to compare different machines, different algorithms, you apply them on the same problem. This is exactly what these people did. They take some problems and they apply them. Each of them is applying his or her method, and they try to show that their method works best. Lewis Carroll is exactly like this. As you can see, when he started doing logic, it's exactly what he says. He says, oh, in the last few days, I have been working at the logical algebra and seem to be getting to a simpler notation than Boole's. So he's doing exactly the same thing. He enters in the field and he tries to develop his own system. You can see here in this table how he progressively was developing his notation until he got the final one that you can find in his books. Now, what I mean by rivalry here is that for the same thing, you can write it in different ways, and sometimes it has really important consequences. It doesn't say exactly the same thing. For instance, if you want to say no x is y, with Boole is using an equation, and Boole and all his British followers were using equational logic. So they would write this as x, y equals 0, meaning the intersection of x and y is empty. While Peirce wouldn't use equations, at least not in his second phase of his research. He would use inclusion, and he would say x is included in the complement of y, which is a very different thing again from the first one. Okay, same proposition, but the way not just semiotically and cognitively, they are very different. Now, interestingly, not only you have here different annotations, different logics, but you have also some national disputes, because basically British logicians followed, Jevons and Venn followed Boole. They defended the idea that equation is the cornerstone of logic, and the systems that you find in Britain are basically equational. But outside Britain, you can find actually different systems that are more inclusional. You can find Peirce, of course, in the United States, uses inclusion. In France, you can find Hugh McCall. In Germany, you can find Schröder or Frege. Frege is just one of these. Here, in the way I'm presenting it, Frege is one among these people who are in competition here. So as you can see, and it's really interesting because in Britain, it was a good thing to be a logician in Britain because there is interest in the subject, but at the same time, it wasn't such a good thing anymore because there was some kind of conservatism, and the idea was to maintain equality as the main operator. Okay, and actually, just if I may add this, even Venn was writing that we should apply some social repression against new proposals. So you see, there is even the idea that we should socially repress people who try to invent new systems. So you see how the conservatism in UK, it's the idea that we went into this heritage stage. The idea is that we should preserve Boole's heritage, while in other countries, you have more like new systems based on other copulas. Okay, so again, the context that interests me is the context of rivalry. Okay, we are in the end of 19th century, you have a rivalry between different logicians. One of them is Lewis Carroll. But just a word about how the story ended, because if you read, for instance, Clarence Irvin Lewis in 1918, his survey of symbolic logic, very important book. This one for sure is understudied. He talks of the classic, or Boole-Schröder algebra of logic. Remember, just 2 slides ago, I was talking about Boole and Schröder as rivals. But here, it's a kind of joint system. They are together. It's the same thing. How did this happen? That's because at the beginning of the 20th century, there has been a switch in the way logicians work. And while before that they were really in rivalry. Starting from the beginning of 20th century, you have some historians of logic. I'm repeating it because it shows the importance of history here and how historians of logic did contribute in the shaping of logic. Historians of logic who tried to build kind of synthesis of the logic systems of the time, and they developed the idea that actually we should not think anymore about these different systems as rival systems. We should think about them as one big system to which everyone has contributed. And you have many of these logicians, historians everywhere. You have Sherman in England, you have Couturat, of course, in France. You have them in different countries, Padua in Italy, etc. And these people together, slowly, they started building one symbolic logic, not different systems. So if I was asked where symbolic logic was born for me as a discipline at the beginning of 20th century, thanks to the work of these authors. But I'm interested in the right before this, when there was still this rivalry between different systems, and Lewis Carroll was one of them. Okay, so very briefly, again, like I said, I'm not going to go into details for the exposition of the system itself. So it's published mainly in this book called Symbolic Logic in 1896. So it's a really very simple logic of terms. You have the universe has things. Collections are groups of things. You form them by either classifying objects together or dividing an existing class to get some subclasses. And now propositions you can have 2 types of them. You can either say that something exists or doesn't exist, like you would say some X exists or some X doesn't exist, or you could have a relation between two classes. You could say some X are Y or some X are not Y, etc. Nothing really special. And for his propositions, therefore, you have just three of them. You have all X are Y, no X is Y, and some X are not Y. He didn't take the O ones because when you say some X are not Y, you mean that some X are not Y. So you can, every proposition in O can be transferred for Carroll into a proposition in I. Okay, so with this, you can now go ahead and see a bit the notation he has. So his notation is very simple again, really very simple. If you think about the class XY, the intersection of X and Y, either there is something in the intersection or there isn't. If there is something, you put 1. If there is no intersection, you put 0. That's it. His whole notation is based on this. Some X or Y, you put 1 in the compartment XY, or you put the subscript Y after XY. No X is Y, so there is no intersection. You put 0 in the compartment XY or after XY. And again, this is for classes, but again, he has some kind of specific notation for propositions, something a bit like this. Okay, so the advantage of this, as you can see, is that contrary to most logicians of his time as well, and this is something that, for which he was praised, he had, you can clearly separate the notation for classes and notation for propositions. Now, yeah, do I have still some time? Let me see. Yeah, okay, I have 12 minutes if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so for syllogisms, again, he's still traditional in the sense that he still considers syllogism specifically.
You need 10. If you need 10, Amirouche, you can also take it, but try not to go beyond that.
Oh, I said 12. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, okay. 12 is okay, yeah?
Yes, sure.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so syllogisms. So he defined 3 figures of syllogisms, and he has an algorithm to tell you how. I mean, you just go through the algorithm. And you, I think someone is talking. Okay, so you can tell through the algorithm which to which figure your reasoning belongs, and you can say whether it's valid or not. The diagrams, you can see the kind of diagrams he had. It's a bit like Venn, but it's more in the form of a square. There are some pluses in this. So one of them is what Leo was mentioning at the beginning, the idea of rules. If you have a problem with Venn diagram, you just have one diagram and you have to read the conclusion from this diagram. But with Carroll, you don't do that. So you take your diagram, you apply some rules in order to extract a smaller diagram, and you read on the smaller diagram. So you see the difference with Venn, you have to read on the complex diagram. With Carroll, you apply some rules in order to deduce the conclusion and then read the conclusion from the simpler diagram. The method of trees, this is one of the things that are often highlighted as one of the best works of Carroll. So it's very original, of course. And I would like to show a small curiosity. It's that one of his colleagues, John Cook Wilson, also developed a similar method, the method of trees, exactly at the same time. But John Cook Wilson was calling it the method of hanging plants, while Carroll was calling it the method of trees. Now, I mentioned John Cook Wilson, the colleague of Carroll, because he was a philosopher the professor of philosophy in Oxford, and he was opposed to symbolic logic. So this shows you actually how important is the work of Lewis Carroll. I could go to list some contributions of Carroll and his logic, but I think the really important point on which I really would like to insist, and for me, the main merit of Lewis Carroll's logic is that it exists. It's a symbolic method. Today, it looks for us so trivial to talk about symbolic logic, mathematical logic, but at the time, it wasn't. It wasn't, specifically not at Oxford. So the main merit of Carroll's logic is that it exists, it is symbolic. Now, why you do a symbolic logic? Lewis Carroll says that you have basically 3 main things he wanted to prove about logic. He wanted to prove that logic is useful, that logic is interesting, logic is easy. Now, for useful, it's very simple. Lewis Carroll was always intervening in the public debates of his time, and he was always trying to show that, to apply logic in real life problems. For instance, during some of his vacations in Eastbourne, there was a controversy about vaccination, and he spoke or wrote in the local newspapers to say that, I'm concerned myself with the logical accuracy of the weapons, not the results of the fight. He wasn't concerned whether you should vaccinate or not, but he was there to assess the arguments. So he believed that logic was important in public debates. So the usefulness was not a problem for him.
Yeah, I think Я не хочу мелочь.
Andre, I think you have to close your microphone, Andre.
Please, all of you make sure that your microphone is not on, because we only want to listen now to Amirouche. Please.
Oh, thanks very much.
Look carefully.
Thanks. So logic is useful, whether symbolic or not. Logic is also interesting, Carroll says, and he even invented some game based on logic, so it doesn't have to be boring. Carroll believed that logic was useful and interesting, but is it easy? That's the difficulty. He admits that traditional logic can be complicated, and therefore for him, symbolic logic was supposed to make logic easier, because he says if you think about some complicated algebraic problem that you work out with x, y, etc., imagine it would require some, imagine it's a complicated problem, right? Mathematical problem. Imagine the misery of having to solve it with words only and being forbidden the use of symbols. This will give you a very fair idea of the difference in solving a syllogism or solities between the use of symbolic logic and of formal logic. So you see, for him, symbolic logic, the use of symbolism was supposed to make logic easier than it is, because it offers this economy of labor. Now, if he wanted really to give an easy symbolic logic or an easy logic to make logic easier, why did he make it complicated with his theory of existential import? Okay, now maybe I will go straight to the next slide, because I will show you completely what happens there actually. So when it comes to existential import, you have some propositions, and you want simply to say whether they do assert or do not assert the existence of their subject. Since for Lewis Carroll, he had 3 possible propositions, so you have basically 8 possible theories of the existential import. Yes means that they do assert the existence of their subject, and no, it means they do not assert. Or yes, it means they have existential import, no, they don't have. So among all the possible theories that Lewis Carroll listed himself, this is how he explains his decision. He says, I will first try to make he says anyone can make any theory he or she wants, pick whatever, but it has to be consistent with the accepted facts of logic. Now, of course, it's not very clear what the accepted facts of logic, but it doesn't matter. For our purpose, what I want to explain is how he does it. So for him, after some discussion, he says these are the only views that are consistent with the accepted facts of logic, number 2 and number 5. And after he did this, the second step into deciding what would be a good theory of existential import is that it has to be consistent with the actual facts of life. And for that, he says number 2 is the only one that's consistent with the accepted facts of life and the accepted facts of logic and the actual facts of life. So it's the second one where it says that I propositions assert the existence of their subject, E propositions don't, and the A propositions do as well. Well, it's very simple. These two, it's kind of okay. I mean, or most logicians will use the same made the same decision. So for I propositions, they assert. E propositions do not assert. The problem is for this one is when you have an A proposition. Most logicians of his time, like Venn, for instance, that I will speak about in a couple of slides, says that when you say all A are B, it's just the same as no A is not B, and therefore there is no import. But Carroll says, no, it's not true, because in natural languages, well, the way people speak and all this kind of thing, it should be like this. When you say all animals are beautiful, what you mean is that no animal is not beautiful, and at the same time, you are saying that some animals are beautiful. And since these kind of propositions have existential import, it follows that the big one has existential import. And therefore, for Carroll, the A propositions do have existential import. Now, as you can see, this complicates things a lot, because take a very simple syllogism like barbar, for instance. If you were right, if you didn't have import, you would handle it, basically prove it like this, mathematically. But if you add import, you need to add this. You need to add the sum, and therefore you need to do something like this. So you see, the proof becomes more complicated. Think about, for instance, a simple problem with diagrams. The first one above is without import. The second one is with import. You don't need to know what the problem is. You already see that with existential import, it gets more complicated. So why did Carroll, and he knew of these kind of difficulties, adopt the existential import? And why didn't he accept this doctrine that has done so much to simplify traditional formal logic, the interpretation of universal proposition as not involving the existence of its subject? This brings me to my question: why make things simple when you can make them complicated? Why did he make things complicated? He could have made it simple, right? And he would have had great system in the end, simpler at least. I will do this with this last section in my presentation. 4 minutes.
Very briefly, please, Amirouche.
Yeah. I'm trying to follow exactly
okay.
the timeline. So I said I'm comparing Carroll and Van very briefly. I just want to explain the difference of approach for Van. Remember, Carroll was really very careful to have his decision fit with the actual facts of life. Van doesn't have that. For Van says that, okay, I will try to read here what he says because it's really important. He says we are in face of 3 very distinct questions with which you must prevent from getting entangled more than is absolutely unavoidable. The first is one of popular convention. The second is one of ordinary logical legislation and usage. And the third is one of convenience and consistency in the working out of the symbolic and generalized logic. The first 2 do not concern us much here. We have had to repudiate once for all any bound obligation to either the language of common life or that of the common logic. So you see, when Venn develops his symbolic logic, he says, we don't need to worry about common life. What we need to worry about is convenience and consistency. So you see, the approach is completely different from that of Carroll. And of course, this has consequences for him because, as I said, Venn with his theory can very easily represent A propositions there because they are similar to a negative universal proposition. But he doesn't know how to represent a particular proposition. And you can see that when you read Venn talking about particular propositions, he tries to minimize their importance because he doesn't know how to handle them. He says, for instance, particular propositions in their common acceptations are of somewhat temporary and unscientific character. This is very different from Carroll. Carroll says very clearly that particular conclusions are often the best we can get. So Carroll uses and pays attention to particular propositions, while Venn doesn't. You see, this is one consequence of Carroll going the complicated way. He manages better particular propositions. As you can see, he has his own notation for particular propositions. He handles them very well. Another example, and I will really conclude very soon. I have 2 minutes. So it's about promoting symbolic logic. Venn was against teaching symbolic logic as a replacement for traditional logic. Precisely, he says, because traditional logic is closer to real life, so we should not replace it with modern logic. Carroll has the opposite position. He says symbolic logic is superior to formal logic, and I have no doubt that one day it will replace traditional logic. So you see, Carroll, because he stayed close, he was conservative in a sense, he stayed close to real life, he actually managed to promote logic better than those who innovated more in a sense. So basically, how I'm going to conclude this comparison is that while life and mathematics were separated in the way Venn conceived his system, for Carroll, mathematics was subordinated to life. Of course, this is very different from the way we see it today, where life is kind of, measured everywhere, and you have, in a sense, life subordinated to mathematics. So my conclusion is really this: why make things simple when you can make them complicated? Well, Carroll says simply because things are complicated. Things are complicated, and if you want to have a useful logic that will apply in real life, you need to keep them complicated. Don't simplify at the expense of the usefulness of the system that you are creating. This is why he maintained this import, while all the other logicians did not. But then it failed to justify the utility of symbolic logic. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Amirouche. Too bad that we don't have the ability to listen to the round of applause that you deserve for this.
Oh, thank you very much.
Talk. But this is how we are doing things nowadays, and we have to live with it. I will open the floor for questions and debate, but I will use my privilege as a moderator to ask you a question. It's apparently simple, but I'm not sure to what extent. And it is about the definition of mathematical logic that you use in your presentation, because you yourself say that, or at least in that part where you don't want to speak about what brought us here, but what were people doing at the time there. And obviously, some of the authors that you mentioned, we will easily agreed that it's some kind of mathematical logic, and there is symbolic logic. So the first question is whether it is the same thing or not, and one is included in the other or not. But as I say, symbolic. Okay, if you can translate an argument into an operation or manipulation of symbols, probably you would include it in the algebra, the algebraic logic of algebra, or one of these names. Never mind. But it's quite clear. But there are other things that you mentioned in which I think it is less clear. For example, the use of diagrams. At least Lewis Carroll's diagrams seem to imitate in some way operations with symbols. But there were other diagrams that were not exactly like that, including, for example, when you mentioned his book on Euclid. What you showed was, a flow, a deductive flow, what follows from what, but that's not really any kind of mathematic or symbolic logic. So I would like to ask you, at that time that you were considering, what would you put inside or outside or in the middle of the way that becomes from other kinds of logic into mathematical logic?
Thank you very much. Of course, it's of course a very important question, and you're absolutely right. Usually, I try to use here the expression mathematical. I use mathematical logic because it's a general term that we use today, and everyone roughly understands what I'm talking about. But if you start looking at it, you're right. It's not obvious at all what we call mathematical logic. As you know, at the time, different names were used. You have mathematical logic, symbolic logic, algebra of logic, dual logic, algorithmic logic, etc. Many others. And one point I would like to make is that most of the logicians I mentioned, most of them were against calling the new logic mathematical logic. Most of them said that this is not mathematical at all. This logic has nothing to do with mathematics. It's a pure accident that they were using symbols before that look like those of mathematics. So some people say, let's use the same symbols because of their suggestiveness. For instance, if we use a plus or multiplication, so this way it suggests this idea of commutativity, for instance, and therefore it kind of helps. But other people were warning, no, don't do that, because then you might be misled by the suggestiveness, etc. So you have a lot of discussions, and you're right. Most of these people were against it. But this is really an interesting point, I think. Who really, from the very beginning, insisted on the mathematical character of symbolic logic? It's the opponents to symbolic logic. I believe that those who define this mathematical nature of modern logic, it's those opposed to mathematical logic. I mentioned John Cook-Wilson before, but you can read many other logicians. They say very explicitly, this is mathematics. This is a mathematical theory. You can escape, you can say it's not, etc. It looks similar. This is mathematical. And the identity, I'm talking about identity again, as you understood. I really pay attention to the social dimension. The mathematical identity of modern logic is given to it by its opponents, those who are against mathematical logic. Those who are mathematical logicians, most of them actually, either they were against it, they were hesitating, or they say it happened to be the same, etc. So it's much more complicated than that. The way I use it here, the way I selected basically my authors, I prefer to talk of symbolic logic. Those who thoroughly use symbolic logic are, for me, symbolic logicians, mathematical logicians, roughly. That's how I use it here. But even there, it's not that simple, because some logicians refuse to use symbolic symbols, and they are still considered to be symbolic logicians, like John Neville Keynes. If you read books on symbolic logic, history of symbolic logic, they mention John Neville Keynes because he used a certain type of problems like generalization of all processes, and these are typical problems of mathematical logic. And although he was against this symbolic logic, they still put him there because they told him you could not have done it if you were not trained in symbolic logic. I'm sorry, I know my answer is very long, because there is no answer basically to this kind of questions. Is that I use the word because it's kind of for communication, but of course you're right. There is no, it's not appropriate at all. It's not appropriate at all.
No, I think the answer is quite clear, I must say.
Thank you very much.
Because again, the situation is complicated.
Yeah, so, of course, exactly. Thanks. We know what, that's exactly what I did. I simplified, but I could have kept it complicated, and it would have been very difficult to communicate about it. But it's exactly, you're right about that. Can I just answer to your final question actually about the diagram? The Euclid ones, because I think this will interest a lot of people also working, for instance, square of opposition, etc. First of all, again, if anyone has an answer to this one, I would be very happy to hear that. Those diagrams where I showed you have different propositions of Euclid, and deriving from other propositions, etc. First of all, I don't know of any other diagram before this one of Lewis-Carroll in 1879 where the propositions of Euclid are represented like that, where you have lines showing which propositions follow from another one. If you know of any others before, I will be happy to see them. But the second remark is that for me, it's exactly this way of representing these diagrams are exactly the same as the trees, for instance, logic trees, or the square of opposition. In the square of opposition, you just have, some propositions there, and then you have some lines indicating the relation. You're right, the lines are not important, but in the square of opposition, the lines have absolutely no importance. You can remove the lines in the square of opposition. You can remove the lines. You just have to say which the connection, which relation is between this and this. You can put words between those two things, and that's it. It's the position of those propositions that's really important. It's in this sense. Okay, the lines are only in order to indicate some kind of relation between different propositions. And this is exactly what Carroll does in those Euclid diagrams. This is exactly what we do when we do logic trees, for instance. And this is, I think, in this sense, they are just diagrams, you're right. But Peirce was saying that every diagram is a logic diagram in sense. So it's the boundary is very, very difficult to say here.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Interesting answer. And I think that the best way for you to ask you, the audience, to ask for or to come up with your question, please write it in the chat. I see that Jerry we had a remark, but I don't know, Jerry, if you want to translate that into a question. If you want, you're invited to do so. If not, anyone else is invited to ask for a question, and I will give you the floor.
If I can answer to Jerry's question, if I get it right, because it said so there are times when simplicity is called for, and how, and actually Lewis-Carroll in some cases he says actually for the solution of this problem let's forget the existential import for this problem specifically. So you see he drops it because it's easier to solve it with this. And so himself, exactly, he knows that it's complicated, and sometimes he does, as Jerry says, or drop it. But I don't know, Jerry, whether I can say that I can determine from the beginning which times are those where simplicity is called for. Because simplicity, you can go for simplicity, but it has a cost. That's what Carroll teaches us. The cost is that you create a divide with the practices of real life. So if you want your logic to apply in real life, you should not go for simplicity. You should go for truthfulness or something like this. You should be consistent with the practices of real life.
Okay, and Jerry has another comment. I would say that it's one that is connected to our life nowadays, because it has to do with the question of how making the anti-vax or pro-vax question simple. So if you want to refer to that, or now we have also a question by Zeno Tofano about the possibility that Lewis-Carroll may have considered possibilities and probabilities. So you choose if you want to answer shortly to Jerry or directly to Zeno.
No, but Jerry, it's not really about the vax or not. It's for everyone. He's just saying that basically in our society, in our life nowadays, people want simple answers. They always want to go for the simple. How can you promote the idea of that you should go to the complicated, etc., that things are complicated? And I don't have a solution for this, but I guess a solution is to teach. When I teach philosophy, I always start with this. I always say that I know you're saying that philosophers are complicating things, and I'm sure that philosophers are complicated things, but the idea of philosophy is to exhibit the complication that's there. The idea is to exhibit the complication that there. Things are complicated. And I try to show that things are complicated, but I don't have any other solution other than this, than education. Yeah. So okay, that was my only answer for Jerry. But for Zeno now, did Lewis-Carroll consider possibilities and probabilities as did George Boole? Okay. Yeah. Well, in Lewis-Carroll, he doesn't connect much. There is just one entry in his private journal where he kind of connects a bit and introduces some modalities, but he doesn't connect necessarily logic, mathematical logic, with probabilities. But of course, he did some work on probabilities. He did actually. There is a book called Pillow Problems, because it's about some problems that he was handling. He was trying to solve mentally, without paper and pencil. And this collection of problems includes, I think, if I'm not mistaken, about 14 problems or something. And it's problems in different disciplines. Huh? Okay, 14 of them are about probabilities. And the last one, number 72, is quite famous, and I've seen it already included in some anthologies of the most important problems in the history of probabilities. It's because it's kind of paradoxical problem. So yeah, Lewis Carroll did work on probabilities, but he did work on that, but not like George Boole. Someone who worked like George Boole is Hugh McCall, for instance. Hugh McCall did work like, he did work on logic and he connected it to probability. Van, of course, not Lewis Carroll. Lewis Carroll, I think he did work on both, but I at least personally, I don't see much how he goes from one to the other.
Okay, let's go on. So we have a comment by Hendrik Boom. I think this is commonly associated to Einstein, even though I have never seen the exact reference, as it usually happens with things associated with him. But anyway, we have the next question by Jerry Chandler. What are the comparative roles of multiplication in the logical diagrams of the 19th century?
I don't know what this is. What multiplication in diagrams? I don't know what that means. Sorry. Multiplication in the logical diagrams. What does that mean?
Jerry, you want to clarify?
Yes.
You can also speak, of course.
Yes.
Yeah, please.
If you would unshare your screen, it would be nice. Yeah, so the operation of multiplication as it is used in mathematics is rather different from, as I understand it, at least, than it is used in the logics of 19th century. So what multiplication is a relational content between numbers, usually, all numbers or integers at least. And so how does this figure into particularly the nature of the logic of the particular, which you assert is part of Dodd's or Lewis Carroll's view of logic. So it really gets the question of what's the relationship between sum and the notion of particular. Does that make sense to you, or should I?
Right. What confuses me is the word multiplication, because there is no multiplication in logic. There is a symbol of multiplication. They multiply, and there is the kind of analogous of multiplication, which is intersection. But you don't have strictly multiplication in algebra of logic. The algebra of logic is based on some analogies between the arithmetics, if you want, and the operations of logic, between the laws of the mind and the laws of algebra. So when you have multiplication in mathematics, you have the intersection in logic. But you don't have multiplication in logic.
I was particularly concerned about the way C.S. Peirce used the multiplication sign in his notion of logic.
Okay, so okay, good. So it's about the multiplication sign. Okay. And there you're right, multiplication sign, not about the operation, just a sign. And yes, Peirce was using the multiplication sign for the representation of particular propositions. You're right about that. So he just puts the multiplication in a compartment. And if you put the multiplication in the compartment, it means that there is something there. And therefore, you're right. In order to represent a particular proposition, it's very easy. You just put this multiplication sign there. So, but as I'm saying, it doesn't mean there is a multiplication. It simply means that it's like picking one individual. When you put the multiplication, it's like when teachers on a board, they put like this cross to say that this is a dot. This is a point in the plane. So it simply means you are indicating an individual. So it's not multiplication. It's more the sign of multiplication, which helps representing existence. So Peirce had it. You're right about that. Lewis Carroll had it as well, and some other. Van didn't have it actually. Van, he as I said before, Van didn't handle very well particular propositions, and in his article where he introduced his diagrams, he didn't even mention at all particular propositions, how you would represent them. This came a bit later with Peirce and Carroll indeed.
The source of my concern is more directed towards the relationship between the particular as used by Carroll versus the particular as used by C.S. Peirce. The difficulty, the logical, scientific difficulty really that comes up is that the operation of multiplication is used in the logic of chemistry. in in the arithmetic sense. And C.S. Peirce has always claimed that his logic was based on the reality, if you would, of the bedrock of chemistry. And so this is where the tension arises in my question.
Yeah, well, really, I will not be very helpful, because I suspect that what you mean by the Peirce multiplication, you mean his theory of quantification, where you have this multiplication of different individuals, etc. That's why, because I don't know actually what I don't know what is this, how Peirce uses multiplication. I know with Peirce diagrams, he does use actually this what we call the line of identity. So every time you put exactly, you use line of identity, but that's in existential graphs. And when you have a line, it means simply that there exists something. But if I may say a word about this, because the project of Peirce and Carroll are completely opposite. Carroll does what we call calculus, I mentioned before. Peirce doesn't do that. Peirce is not concerned about eliminating and this and this. He does, as we know, analysis. And analysis is exactly the opposite of calculus. When you do calculus, what you're concerned with is that you try to find the conclusion as fast as possible. So you don't care about how many signs you have. You don't care about all this. What you need is that an economy of labor. You don't need. You're not looking for an economy of sign. But Peirce, what he's doing is he's doing analysis. What he wants is to break reasoning, exactly like Frege actually, to break reasoning into as many steps as possible. So Peirce is not concerned about economy of space. He's concerned about economy of sign. His point is that I need to break this reasoning into as many steps as possible. Carroll is interested. I will summarize it like this. Carroll is doing reasoning. Peirce is doing the analysis of reasoning. And these are very different things. Peirce wrote a lot about this, and he says explicitly he despises even all these logicians who are doing calculus. And he says this is even a machine can do it. It's not interesting. What interests me is how to analyze the reasoning. So they are not the same. They are not really the same. Yeah. Yeah, that's all I can say, I'm afraid. Yeah. Other than that, I really don't have anything really interesting about this, about the multiplication, I'm afraid.
So then you feel that the relationship between analysis and synthesis, as it is used in the natural sciences, as the relationship between deduction and induction, is rather different in these two cases.
They are very different, yes. Just if you're interested in chemistry specifically, there is another logician that might interest you. So his name is William Ernest Johnson, and he's British. He published his logic in 1892, and he does the same thing as what you were talking about, synthesis and analysis, and he refers to chemistry as well. They refer to chemistry, they say we are combining our propositions, our terms, etc., the same way as chemistry does. I think they ever call it the chemical composition or something. Yeah, but it's really different. Yeah, synthesis and analysis are really different things. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I hope I was helpful.
So we have time for a couple of questions. People, of course, we have been already around for an hour and 20 minutes, but I would say if someone else wants to ask, to comment, we are open still for that. Okay, if not, we can leave it here. I think that not only the talk was very clear and interesting, but also we had a nice conversation about it at the end, thanks to the questions from the audience and the very clear answers as far as complication or simplicity allow in this case. So I would like to thank you in the name of all of us here at the audience and the organizers who thought about putting this very interesting session together. There will be more, as I understand, in the future. Raniv, you want to add some things for the future, invite people for additional talks?
Yeah, sure. So thank you to everybody for the session today. And the next session will be November 10 with Michael Kaminsky and Nissim Frances from the Israel Institute of Technology, and they will present a talk about many-varied logic. So everybody is welcome to join us for this next session.
And thanks. And can I just conclude also on my side by thanking you all for presenting, not for presenting, but for for sharing, organizing, and for attending as well. it's really always a great pleasure to, to talk about one's research, and this is a really great place for that. I really enjoyed that. Thank you all.
Okay,
All
thank you
right.
very much. And we are concluding here until the next time. Thank you, and great applause for you, Amirouche.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you, Jam.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Okay.
Oh.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.